We spend a lot of time thinking about engaging external stakeholders on sustainability communication. But what about internal? Your employees are your best messengers, and making sure that they're on board will help you go far. Hey everybody, and welcome to the Sustainability Communicator, the podcast that dives deep into how companies can better tell their sustainability stories and drive real impact. I'm your host, Mike Howard, and I've spent the last 15 years living and breathing sustainability communications. First as a journalist for GreenBiz and other outlets, and then in the corporate world, helping global companies craft and share their sustainability journeys. Each episode, we cut through the jargon and greenwashing to explore the real challenges, risks, and opportunities in sustainability communications. We'll hear from leaders who are walking the talk and learn how they're navigating this complex landscape. Whether you're a sustainability professional, communications expert, or just someone who cares about how businesses are addressing our world's biggest challenges, you're in the right place. Let's get started. While many companies spend significant time and resources communicating sustainability externally, more often than not, internal communication gets a lot less love. Yet as many more companies are turning to greenhushing in hopes of avoiding external backlash, this is compelling them to turn inward to reassure employees that they remain committed to sustainability progress. A successful sustainability strategy also requires the participation of employees across the company. It can't just be the sustainability leads. And sustainability potentially helps recruit and retain the best talent. To better understand the inner workings of internal sustainability communication, today we're checking in with Alexandra Talleur, an internal communications lead at HP, who helps evangelize the company's sustainability impact to employees.
All right, so just to dive right on in, how would you define internal sustainability communication from a high level? What does it aim to do, and how does it differ from external comms?
Yeah, absolutely. So put very simply, it's really about communicating with your internal audiences about the sustainability work you do, and importantly, also how your workforce can take part. So typically there are two aims. One would be making employees aware of what your company is doing out in the world on sustainability issues. And then number two, it's also about what employees can do within their own roles and within their communities.
Sustainability comms has changed a lot in the last couple of years, and I'm assuming internal comms has changed a lot as well. We've been seeing lots of calls for disclosing more information to your employees and engaging employees. But how do you think that internal sustainability communications has changed the most, maybe in the last 5 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you hit one on the head, which is that employees, I think across the board, are getting more and more interested in what their employer is doing from a sustainability standpoint and from a social impact standpoint as well. I think that's definitely a trend that we've seen externally, that we're seeing internally also. I think some of the similarities, I'll just say, between internal and external comms is for both, it can be so hard to break through in a very sort of crowded, noisy environment. I think consumers and employees are being hit by a lot of news every day. So hooking your audience and breaking through is definitely one commonality. But I do think internal comms has some unique challenges as well.
So I know you've worked in both external facing and internal facing roles. And what are some of those unique internal comms challenges? Can you talk a little bit about those unique challenges for internal communicators?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one unique challenge for internal comms is helping employees see themselves as part of the work or see the work as relevant to their role at the company. For a handful of employees or teams within a large organization, they may be in a dedicated sustainability role where they're really owning and driving the strategy. But for the vast majority of employees, they have their day job, right? They are maybe working in IT or they're working in legal. And I think for those employees, it can be hard to understand why they should care, why they should pay attention. Obviously, some employees, I think, just have a natural interest or passion in sustainability. And those are the ones that we would call kind of like the hyper-engaged employees that are a little bit easier to hook and pull in with internal comms. But for the broader employee base, I think helping them see why it's relevant to their work, what role they can play, and why they should feel proud of the work that your company is doing is a big part of it.
When we were talking ahead of the recording about this kind of, I think what I was getting at was that a lot of sustainability communicators over the years, we'd like to make a lot of big claims about why sustainability is important. One of them has been, sustainability helps attract and retain the best talent. But I've recently come to think, is this really true? Do we have any data to actually back this up? And I'm thinking more anecdotally, I have lots of friends that are very talented at what they do, and they're not sustainability professionals. Mm-hmm. But, I don't I don't think they want to go work for like an evil corporation necessarily, but when they're deciding where to work, they're not as purpose driven as maybe I am. So that's not necessarily the deciding factor for them. And my friends are actually pretty forward thinking, they care about climate, they care about all these issues. So it made me think, like, do we actually have any proof that companies that invest in sustainability do a better job of attracting and retaining the best talent? And then you mentioned the word, the green gap.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit more about that? I'm curious what you think, from an internal cost perspective, like, is that what you're seeing? Like, I know you're not working in HR, but like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an interesting question. So the term I mentioned earlier was the green gap, which I think a lot of your listeners will probably be familiar with,
Mhm.
but it's this idea that when it comes to purchasing decisions, a lot of consumers say that they would pay more for a more sustainable product, but then that doesn't always translate to what they're actually doing at the register when they're purchasing a product. So I've wondered in the employee space if there's maybe a similar thing happening with attraction, I think in particular hiring. So retention, I think, is a little bit different. And I'll speak to that in a moment. But I think that the common factor is likely around economics. So I think my theory is that in a perfect world, when employees have a lot of choice, a lot of people who even maybe ones who don't consider themselves sort of hardcore sustainability advocates would ultimately prefer to work for an employer that aligns with their values, whether
Mhm.
that's on the sustainability or social impact side. But that, when pressed and when people are looking for jobs, it may not be something that obviously leads them to turn down a role. And I think that the common factor there could be around economics, right? In a good economy, people can maybe make different decisions at the cash register, just like they could make when they're looking at companies to work for. The retention piece, though, I will say, and I don't have a data point to speak to this, I'd be curious if any of your listeners do, but I do think it's clear that having a greater sense of purpose or fulfillment at
Mhm.
work, I do think leads to greater longevity and loyalty between employees and their employers. So whether that points directly to a company's sustainability strategy or just a general sense that your employer kind of has everyone's best interest in
Mhm.
mind, I do think that likely has a good role to play in retention.
Right. And I'm not trying to be cynical about this, but I think sustainability communication is going through kind of I don't know, a growing up period right now
Mhm.
where, like when you and I probably first started our careers, we were really drinking the Kool-Aid of,
Yeah.
companies are going to save the world and all this and that. And not saying that it doesn't, but
Mhm.
I think now, especially with more greenwashing regulations coming out, there's just more scrutiny over these lofty claims that we're making. And it might not always be true, and it can't, maybe it's not a blanket case, right? Like, I've even thought, as I've kind of, approached my mid to late 30s, and I have friends that we're all in different parts of our life. Like, yeah, I have friends that started their career as very purpose driven people, and now they're like, hey, I gotta like pay my mortgage, I gotta, pay for daycare. It doesn't mean that they're gonna go work for ExxonMobil, but like, what is important to them kind of shifts. And again, this doesn't mean that companies should just scrap sustainability, but I think as sustainability communicators, maybe we need to start just being more robust with the things that we're saying. And especially as we're selling this internally to leaders, there was a whole wave of CEOs that were probably originally sold sustainability as, oh yeah, it's gonna like give you a competitive edge and this and that. And then when that didn't end up happening, then they decided, okay, we're gonna backtrack from this. And going on a rant here, but yeah, I think it's just very interesting, especially from an internal perspective of, like, as we try to create the value proposition of sustainability. There's clearly a value proposition here. Like, companies need to be doing this work. People don't want to just be mindless automatons working at Conglomero. And so, so yeah, so I think that's what's so interesting to me about your role, which is a very rare one. And
Mhm.
I guess maybe you could dive in a little deeper. Like, why does HB have your role?
When I was initially hired, HP had already had strong internal resources around communicating externally about their sustainability work, but they were gearing up to announce their public goals for 2025 and 2030 and their broader sustainable impact agenda, which touches on climate action, human rights, and digital equity. And so we're looking to bring somebody in who would be able to reflect that back to employees. So I would say that initially the impetus was really around
Mhm.
making employees aware of what HP is doing out in the world around sustainability and social impact. And then over time, that's really morphed more into action, I would say. So instead of
Mhm.
just making employees aware of what HP is doing, actually finding ways for employees to take part in that strategy and just take part in their community and kind of be more involved overall.
HP is pretty far along in their sustainability journey and the way they communicate about it. I both used to be at Edelman, and HP was an Edelman client. I don't know if they still are, but I was working with HP pretty closely a couple of years ago on some really cool stuff. So I got to really see under the hood of a lot of the really awesome things that HP does. But what about companies that maybe aren't as far along on their journey, that they're not even necessarily doing a good job communicating externally? And what advice would you give somebody? Maybe they're not even an internal comms manager, maybe they're a communications manager or director at a company, and then they're responsible for internal comms as well. What advice would you give them on how they could even just an entry level version of sustainability internal comms?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I would say companies definitely have to be doing the work. They have to have a sustainability strategy. They have to be making efforts in that space so that they have something to communicate about, which sounds like such an obvious statement. But I do think sometimes the impetus or the desire to communicate sometimes comes actually before the action has really happened. And so I think for companies that do have a sustainability strategy in place and are now looking to communicate about that more internally and externally, one way I think companies can kind of get started on this is if they do have a team that's communicating about this externally, I think finding ways to reflect that back internally, whether it's in employee emails, on your intranet, all hands meetings, just finding natural ways to weave in that content, I think anybody can do regardless of whether they have a dedicated employee communications role for sustainability. I also think that for companies with robust sustainability teams, developing relationships with those teams directly and really seeing them as a source for stories, building those relationships over time really pay dividends. This sounds a bit cheesy, but the way I like to think about it is, we talk about HP's sustainability work, but it's actually the work of 60,000 employees, right? Like sustainability isn't this other entity. It's work that's being driven by the people who actually work for HP. And a lot of them have amazing stories to tell. And so that's part of what we're trying to do, and which I think a lot of companies can do, regardless of whether they have a full-time person dedicated to that.
That's interesting. And I know, everybody said sustainability is everybody's job. Eventually, we should work ourselves out of a sustainability title. But that is a common challenge I've been seeing across different companies I've been talking to recently. Even some of the kind of these sustainability leads that are just trying to get programs implemented.
Yep.
They're reliant on people in the company that do not have sustainability in their title. And their approach has been to talk about, it's kind of the Fight Club approach to sustainability. Like, don't talk about sustainability, don't lead with it, and really speak the language of the stakeholder you're trying to reach. I think as I've become more of a mature sustainability professional, I think I've started to grow beyond the lofty language I used to use, because not everybody is motivated by, and I think passion eventually burns out a little bit, but we still got to do this work, right?
Yeah.
And I think learning to accept the fact that not everyone's going to care about sustainability is something that a lot of sustainability professionals have a hard time swallowing, that, not everyone's going to be like, yay, we're here to save the world. And like that's completely okay. And I think once you achieved that level of self-awareness that, it's not about like, oh, these people are so short-sighted, or they just don't care. How do I get them to care about sustainability? It's more being like, all right, well, what do they care about? And that probably ties into what we're trying to achieve on the sustainability front too. And so I think learning how to speak the language of your internal stakeholders is often not even just the internal comms person's job, but even sustainability people at large. So it's really great that HP has someone like you, because a lot of times they're sustainability generalists that don't have the comms expertise. And so they're working really in a really difficult way to engage their internal stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you just said around finding the value proposition and the language that works for different internal stakeholders is so key. And I completely agree that I think a big part of the growing up process for any sustainability professional is kind of accepting what's pragmatic and what works above what the ideal may be. So I'm a big fan of approaches that are creative and pragmatic and are kind of working with the reality within a particular company.
Are you able to talk about any specific campaigns that HP has had recently to engage employees or internal stakeholders on sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one that other companies can definitely leverage, whether or not they have a dedicated employee comms person on this. So an example would be HP in June released its annual sustainable impact report, which we know is a really important asset for investors, for regulators, but for employees or the average employee, probably not going to matter quite as much, right? I think HP's report this year clocked in at 208 pages. So
Oh
again, robust from a reporting
That might
standpoint.
be the longest report I've ever heard of.
Yeah, a lot of great transparency in there. But obviously for the average employee, not going to wade through 208 pages, nor probably should they from a productivity standpoint. So what we did this year is really condense the key statistics and takeaways from the report into an infographic that we released to employees. In past years, we've leveraged the full report as well as the executive summary. But this year, we just decided, why not take it a step further and just crystallize it down to the 12 most important stats in the report that we want to drive home with employees. And then obviously producing that in a slightly more engaging way where it's more visual, less text, with then opportunities to click through into the report and read more if they want to, just felt like the right approach. So I think that the key learning there is back to what we were just talking about around creativity and pragmatism is be realistic about what employees are going to engage with when this isn't their full-time role. It's probably not going to be a 200 plus page report, but it might be 12 stats that they see in an infographic on the intranet one day. And so finding that balance between educating employees and putting the information out there without expecting them to do something funky that probably you and I wouldn't even do is a good rule of thumb.
I'm still just shocked that your report is that long. That's I as somebody who also creates reports, I have nothing but solidarity with whoever on your team is writing that, because that is,
they are hard workers. They're impressive people.
I think the longest one I've worked on is 100, and I can't imagine that's a lot.
Yeah.
And that's a great point too. Of what do you do with sustainability reports, right? Especially like a lot of times they're more focused externally, maybe towards investors, but employees are a really important audience. And they're not going to be looking at the same stuff that maybe an ESG rater is looking at. And maybe they're more interested in the feel good stories and maybe still some of the data, but I think I love that idea of an infographic. And then any other campaigns that you might be able to talk about, like maybe less about the report, but just like there's lots of cool initiatives that HP is working on. How do you get your employees excited about it? And like, how do you know that they, not only do they care, but like, do you do any like internal surveys to see like what the employee sentiment is on sustainability ever, things like that?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share another example. So this one actually comes from Earth Day, and we decided to do, instead of talking about work that HP was doing and using Earth Day as a moment to celebrate that, we really wanted to celebrate employees that are doing the work. And so we did a video-based campaign where we selected 10 employees from across the company and across the globe who had, in our words, gone beyond for the planet. And we ended up uncovering some really amazing stories of employees who had taken the initiative outside of their core role at HP to make an impact. Some of them were in dedicated sustainability or social impact roles, and it was featuring a particularly successful initiative they had done. Others, it was folks who worked in any number of different roles at HP, but who were really personally passionate about sustainability and who had maybe spearheaded an initiative or gone beyond in some way. One of them was an employee who was based in our Barcelona office who created a really robust bike to work program. So it was examples like that. It ran the gamut from employees having an impact at their site or in their community, and employees who were actually impacting a product and making a product more sustainable. So with that, we found that number one, recognition was really successful, which I don't think comes as a surprise. Everyone likes to be seen and celebrated for their work, and employees are no different. Also, people love to see their colleagues celebrated. So it had this really nice ripple effect where it was obviously great for the 10 employees who were featured, but then great for their teams and departments and organizations as well. And then number two, I think that experimenting with the video format obviously can be a lot more engaging. And we've been trying to do more of that overall in our communications. And then just to touch on your question around kind of how we measure success, I will say that HP's intranet platform is fairly traditional, which is kind of a euphemism for saying it's a little bit outdated. So we can be pretty limited in terms of the metrics that we can gather. We do always look at things like page visits, unique visitors, but we also go anecdotally. We have a lot of people who are in, I would say, kind of like these concentric circles for folks who are invested in sustainability at HP. And so talking to them and understanding what resonated is definitely one way that we try and gauge, like, did this get on your radar? Did it not? Did this feel good? Did it not? So we do a little bit of both.
So the next question is more focused on what happens when you have employees that don't like sustainability, or maybe, there's lots of misinformation around ESG, this anti-ESG
Hmm.
backlash. I'm assuming at a tech company, there's less of this happening, but, I've worked with companies that maybe they have offices in other parts of the country where the politics are a little different. And I'm not to get into politics here, but sometimes there is pushback of like, why are we doing this woke stuff? Because maybe there's a misunderstanding around exactly what sustainability is.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe you haven't encountered this at HP, but as an internal comms professional, how would you think you should approach that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've never personally received any pushback on any of the sustainability communications or campaigns that we've done. If anything, I would say it's gone the other way where I've seen employees saying, you're not doing enough, or X,
Mm,
Y, and Z doesn't feel like it aligns with our sustainability strategy.
mhm.
So I can't say I've received any backlash, but I do think in those cases, I'll take it back to the value proposition concept, right? Finding a way to speak their language, and maybe you don't lead with sustainability, and maybe you lead with something else. At HP, because we're a hardware company, we're a manufacturer. For us, and again, this sounds a little bit cheesy, but sustainability really is about innovation, right? Like
Mhm.
ultimately, we're trying to solve environmental issues that can be created by products. And so we're trying to reduce the footprint of our products. And so that becomes a design challenge, which I think a
Right.
lot of people can get behind, whether or not they personally feel invested in the health of our planet. So I think that can be a way in for HP in particular, and maybe for other companies as well, where maybe they're not leading with sustainability, but they're leading with a really interesting business challenge, right? That everybody then needs to work together to solve.
Love that answer. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting because I think sustainability is never the right word. We're never using the right words, whether it's ESG, social impact.
Mhm.
Like we're kind of grasping at ways to describe really just better business and like long-term view of business. And I think it gets misconstrued as being, with the culture wars of being this very complicated politicized thing. But really, if you're a human living on Earth, like you have something to gain from sustainability, for lack of a better word, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so finding ways to frame the messaging through the worldviews of the people you're trying to reach is very important. And I agree, like, honestly, you don't have to even mention that sustainability
Hmm.
ever. I mean, in a lot of ways. So I think to me, it's actually an interesting challenge that I've been working on, even as I've been trying to explain what I do to family and friends. Like,
Yeah.
I think they all don't really understand how I pay my bills because I think they think like, oh, it's actually like a job. It's not just a bunch of tree hugging here.
Yeah.
It's really just a way of taking a long-term view of business. And
Yes.
it's,
So.
and yeah, and I think that's something I think we'll be spending our whole careers figuring out, like, how do you explain this? How do you define this? I think that's what makes our roles as communicators so integral, because the technology piece, the systematic piece, like that's hard, but more achievable in my opinion than how do
Mhm.
you change people's worldviews, or how do you,
Yeah.
like, that's the hard part. Humans are the X factor here. That's very difficult.
I
Uh,
agree. Yeah. I think that, and this is related, but I think that a question that we often get is not necessarily why are we working on sustainability, but why are we working on this over that, or this instead of that? So one thing I think a lot of companies will run into is needing to really clearly articulate to their workforce why their strategy is what it is. A common theme that I've seen at HP is employees who want to see impact at a very local level. And
mhm,
so we've had to kind of figure out how to articulate the sustainability strategy and how it actually connects directly to our business impacts,
mhm,
and then still leave room for employees to get involved at a very local level. So that would be something like a beach cleanup, right? So something that
mhm,
employees feel has a very tangible impact in their backyard. I think a lot of times that's what resonates most for people, right? Is just
mhm.
what problems you see in your community, and then how you feel like you should go about solving them. So I think putting a stake in the ground around, our sustainability strategy focuses on X, Y, and Z because that's where we can have the biggest impact is
Mhm.
important to just stay strong on, but
Right.
leave room for employees to take part in ways that feel really meaningful to them.
Love that. All right. Well, to wrap this up, I'd love to learn a little bit more about just how you got into this and your journey. I know you've had a lot of different roles throughout your career so far, but there's a lot of people listening to this who are maybe interested in being you someday or becoming an internal sustainability comms person or just working in sustainability comms in general. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey? Like, how did you get here? What made you want to focus on internal sustainability comms, and maybe just any advice you'd give somebody trying to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, absolutely. I started out actually in the nonprofit industry a little bit over 10 years ago now, working for a girls empowerment organization and then an environmental conservation organization. So very early on, I would say I just had a personal interest in sustainability. And I also loved using a communication skill set. So for anyone who's early on in their career, I would say think about the skills that, number one, are your strengths, but that you want to use day to day. And for me, that was communications, writing, editing, all the rest. So was a nonprofit for a little while, transitioned into comms agencies and worked for Ogilvy and Edelman on both of their dedicated sustainability teams. And would say that was just fantastic exposure to a ton of different industries, clients, challenges. So I think another tip for somebody who knows they're interested in communications and wants to get a lot of experience very quickly, I think communications agencies are a great way to do that because you're just exposed to so much in such a short period of time. I think you'd probably agree with me your time at Edelman, but it's a little bit of a boot camp, right? You get kind of that, you get that breadth. And then for me, just got to a point where I really wanted to go deep with one company. I had loved how dynamic it was to work with different clients, but I wanted to be able to kind of sink into something and really establish a mastery over one subject area. And so going in-house felt like the right move. And then focusing on employee communications honestly just felt like an interesting challenge. I had done some employee comms while I was at Edelman in particular, but really turned my focus to that once I got hired at HP and have found it really rewarding to work with an employee audience, frankly. Partly, I think it's selfish. I'm an employee, and so I feel like I have a vested interest in how I'm communicated to or what my employer is doing. And that helped me just feel a little bit more connected to my audience in a way that I hadn't felt as much when I was working in media relations and in external comms.
Oh, yeah. Well, having done media relations myself, I feel your pain. Well, I've been on both sides as the reporter and the pitcher. I mean, it's funny. I still get pitches. People don't realize that I guess because I contribute to Green Biz still sometimes, or sorry, Trellis sometimes. But yeah, they're, and actually I remember when I was at Edelman, I had someone else at Edelman pitch me because they were confused. Like, they thought I was a report, but they pitched my Edelman email. It's kind of funny. Your advice there is spot on. A communicator needs to wear many hats, and I think there's never a clear path. And yeah, agencies are definitely a great way to kind of go through that boot camp and get the skills that you would need. Yeah. And I do foresee there being more internal comms roles like yours in the future where you got to, and I think this is something that's also kind of the niche that I feel for both internal and external comms is, your general internal comms people don't necessarily understand sustainability as well. And so they might not always be translating it as effectively as someone like you could, someone who speaks both languages. And so I think more companies are going to realize that, we need to have a specialist who actually gets this stuff. This isn't just about Earth Day, like doing some cute activation. This is something this is like core to our business. And so, I definitely see that being a growth area for people interested in getting into this work as from a communications perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too for folks who are interested in this space, I know not too many companies have full-time roles dedicated to internal comms for sustainability, but I think quite a few are starting to have more hybrid roles where maybe you're in an employee comms role and part of your remit is around communicating about sustainability and social impact. So when you're surfing LinkedIn and you're looking at job descriptions, definitely keep an eye out for that. I've seen that crop up over the last couple of years. And then don't be afraid to try and create a role for yourself. I definitely have friends and old colleagues who have had that interest area and who have really been able to pitch themselves as, hey, I have this expertise, and they've been able to actually build that into their role, either at when they're getting hired or once they've been with a company for a few years and they're able to say, hey, I'd love this to be part of my job. So never be afraid to try, I would say.
Of course. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for your time. And hey, everybody, Alexandra Talleur, she's at HP. You should follow her, connect with her on LinkedIn. I'll add that in the show notes. If you ever have any questions about internal comms focused on sustainability, she's probably one of the leading experts I know on this right now. So definitely reach out. Thanks again, Alexandra. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It was great to chat. Take care.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of the Sustainability Communicator. I really appreciate you spending this time with me today, diving into these crucial conversations about sustainability storytelling. If you'd like to stay connected, you can find me, Mike Howard, on LinkedIn, or subscribe to my monthly Engage newsletter, where I share deeper insights about sustainability communications and what's moving the needle in our field. All the links are right there in the show notes. Speaking of staying connected, if you're finding value in these conversations, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could spread the word. Share this episode with a colleague who might benefit from it, or take a quick moment to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your preferred platform. Your support helps us reach more sustainability professionals and continue bringing you these important discussions. And, as always, wherever you are in your sustainability journey, good luck. Keep at it. We need you out there.